Welcome, time travelers. SolaTales here, and tonight's adventure takes us straight into a stone cottage in ancient Ireland, where an elderly weaver spins golden thread by candlelight, while autumn rain whispers against her thatch roof, and the old songs flow from her lips like memories made of music. So dim the lights, sit back, and relax. The evening was painting itself across the Irish countryside in shades of deep purple and silver grey, the last light of autumn fading behind hills that had watched over this valley since the world was young. In the year of our Lord, 743, when the old ways still held sway and the songs of the ancestors lived in every cottage hearth, the landscape rolled in gentle swells toward the distant sea. Ancient stone circles dotted the hilltops like crowns of forgotten kings, and the wind that moved through the grass carried whispers of stories older than memory. From the rocky cliffs that faced the western ocean came the eternal sound of waves meeting stone, a rhythm that had measured time since the first people walked these shores. The sea's voice mixed with the rustle of sedge grass and the distant lowing of cattle being brought home for the night. Smoke rose from scattered cottages across the valley, thin ribbons of grey that spoke of families gathering around their fires as darkness approached. In one small cottage built of fieldstone and love, set in a fold of the hills where hawthorn trees offered shelter from the western winds, an old woman named Brigid was preparing for her evening's work. The cottage had weathered 40 winters since her husband Seamus had built it with his own strong hands, fitting each stone with the care of a man who understood that a home must stand against whatever storms might come. The walls were thick as a man's arm is long, built to hold warmth in winter and coolness in summer. The stones had been gathered from the fields themselves, each one chosen for its size and shape, fitted together with clay mortar mixed with straw from their own green. The roof rose steep and sure, thatched with reeds from the marshy places by the stream, layered so thick that 40 years of rain had barely dampened the inner layers. The door was painted blue, the color of protection, as her grandmother had taught her. Blue keeps the harmful spirits away, the old woman had said, and draws the blessing ones near. Above the door, carved into the stone lintel, was the spiral symbol of the goddess Brigid, she who blessed all women's work and for whom she had been named. Two small windows faced south and east, their wooden shutters now closed against the coming night. In summer, they stood open to catch every breeze, but as autumn deepened toward winter, they were shuttered early to hold the warmth within. Across each opening stretched hide that had been scraped thin and treated with oil until it let light through while keeping wind and rain at bay. Inside, the cottage was warm and welcoming, every corner speaking of a life lived with purpose and love. The floor was flagstone, smooth from decades of footsteps, with woven rush mats, adding softness and color. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding the treasures of a lifetime. Pottery bowls glazed in earth colors, wooden spoons carved by Seamus's careful hands, and skeins of wool dyed in every hue that nature could provide. The heart of the cottage was the central hearth, built of the same fieldstone as the walls, with a chimney that drew the smoke up and away. In the hearth, a fire of peat burned with the slow, steady heat that would last through the longest night. The peat had been cut from the bog in summer, dried in long ricks under the changeable Irish sun, and stacked near the cottage in neat piles that would see the household through until spring. Near the hearth, positioned to catch the best light, stood Brigid's spinning wheel. It was a thing of beauty and purpose, carved from Irish oak by a master craftsman 3 generations past. Her grandmother had worked at this wheel, and her mother after her, and now Brigid's weathered hands guided the ancient wood through its patient dance. The wheel was polished smooth by countless hours of use, its every curve worn to perfect comfort beneath familiar touch. The great drive wheel stood tall as Brigid's waist, its rim bound with strips of leather to grip the driving band. The smaller flyer wheel spun with a higher voice, singing as it twisted fiber into thread. The flyer itself was carved with spirals and Celtic knots, symbols of the eternal cycles that governed all life. Even the treadle bore decoration, leaves and vines that seemed to grow from the very wood itself. As the first drops of rain began to tap against the thatch, Brigid lit her evening candles. These were not the common tallow tips that gave more smoke than light, but precious beeswax candles, golden as summer honey and sweet-smelling as meadow flowers. She saved them for special work, for evenings when the thread must be spun fine and true, when the light must be steady and pure. The candles stood in holders of polished bronze, gifts from her eldest daughter, who had married a metal worker in the next valley. As their flames caught and grew steady, they cast pools of warm light that pushed back the gathering darkness and made the cottage glow like a jewel set in the landscape's crown. Brigid moved about her evening preparations with the grace of long habit, each action flowing naturally into the next. First, she banked the peat fire, arranging the glowing turfs so they would burn slow and steady through the night. The fire's warmth would be essential as the autumn night deepened, and the gentle light would supplement her precious candles. From a wooden chest carved with interlacing patterns, she selected the wool for tonight's spinning. This was not ordinary wool, but fleece from her own sheep, ewes that grazed the sweet grass of the hillside pastures and drank from springs that bubbled up from the earth's deep heart. She had chosen each animal for the quality of its fleece, and their wool rewarded her care with fiber of exceptional softness and strength. The wool had been prepared through the summer months, each step performed with the patience that creates perfection. First, it had been washed in the stream that ran clear and cold from the mountain springs, rubbed with soap made from ash and animal fat, until every trace of lanolin and dirt was gone. Then it had been spread on the grass to dry in the summer sun, turning it white as fresh snow and soft as cloud. Some of the wool had been left in its natural state, but much had been dyed in colors that caught and held the light. Deep red came from madder root, gathered from the boglands, where it grew wild and free. Blue bright as summer sky came from woad, cultivated in her own garden, and processed with secrets passed down from mother to daughter. Golden yellow came from weld, the dyer's rocket that grew along the field edges and bloomed in cheerful profusion. Green was made by dyeing first with weld, then overdying with woad, creating a color like new leaves in spring. Brown came from the bark of oak trees, gathered in spring when the sap was rising and the bark would peel away in long, perfect strips. Purple, most precious of all, came from a lichen that grew on rocks by the sea, scraped away with careful hands and processed with rituals that dated back to the time of the Druids. Each color had its season for gathering, its proper time for processing, its own songs and stories. The dye garden behind the cottage held plants that most people saw as weeds, but that Brigid knew as allies in the ancient art of bringing color to cloth. Watching white wool transform in the dye bath was a magic that never grew old, a reminder that beauty could be coaxed from the simplest materials by one who knew the secrets. Tonight, she chose wool, dyed the color of autumn leaves, a warm golden brown that would make thread suitable for a winter cloak. The wool had been carded with wooden brushes until it lay in soft, airy rowlocks, ready for the spinner's art. Each rowlock was a small bundle of fibers, all lying in the same direction, like tiny rays of captured sunlight waiting to be drawn out into thread. Brigid settled herself on the low stool beside her spinning wheel, her feet finding the familiar worn places on the treadle. The wheel had been adjusted to her body's proportions decades ago, and sitting at it was like settling into an old friend's embrace. She tested the driving band, tightened where necessary, and gave the great wheel an experimental turn. The wheel responded with a gentle whir, the flyer spinning true and steady. The sound was music to her ears, a song she had been hearing since childhood. Her mother had taught her at this very wheel, guiding small hands to understand the mysteries of twist and tension, draft and draw. Feel the wool, her mother had said. Let it tell you what it wants to become. The rhythm began slowly, as it always did. Foot on treadle, wheel turning, the soft whisper of wood against wood and leather against rim. Brigid took the first rowlog in her left hand, teasing out a few fibers with her right. The fibers caught on the leader thread, already attached to the bobbin, and with a gentle pull, the spinning began. This was the moment of magic, when loose fibers became something more. The wheel's rotation put twist into the forming thread, binding the fibers together with bonds stronger than any glue. Brigid's hands controlled the process with movements so practiced they seemed like breathing, drawing out the fibers just fast enough to create thread of perfect consistency. The wool flowed through her fingers like water, but water that could be shaped and guided, convinced to become exactly what was needed. Too much twist, and the thread would be wiry and harsh. Too little, and it would be weak and fuzzy. But just the right amount, applied with just the right tension, created thread that would weave into cloth worthy of kings. As she worked, Brigid began to hum. The melodies came without conscious thought, old songs that had lived in her memory since childhood. These were the working songs, tunes that matched the rhythm of spinning and made the time pass sweetly. The melodies were ancient, passed down through generations of women who had sat at spinning wheels, their voices carrying the songs from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain. The first song was called The Spinner's Blessing, and it told of the goddess Brigid, patron of all women's work. The words spoke of wool transformed by skillful hands, of thread that would become cloth, of cloth that would bring warmth and beauty to those who wore it. As Brigid hummed the melody, she felt connected to every spinner who had ever sung it, part of a sisterhood that stretched back to the beginning of time. Outside, the rain was beginning in earnest. What had started as gentle drops became a steady pattering on the thatch, then a more insistent drumming as the autumn storm found its voice. The sound was not unpleasant, but comforting, like a lullaby sung by the sky itself. The cottage walls were thick and true, the roof tight and well-maintained. Let the storm rage outside. Within these walls was warmth and light and the peaceful rhythm of meaningful work. The rain's percussion added another layer to the evening's music. The spinning wheel provided the melody, steady and constant. Brigid's humming wove through it like a descant, rising and falling with the ancient tunes. And underneath it all, the rain drummed its irregular rhythm, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always changing, yet always the same. Thunder rumbled in the distance, out over the western sea where storms were born, but it was far away still and moving no closer. This was just an autumn rain, one of many that would water the earth through the long months until spring returned. The thunder was a reminder of the storm's power, but not a threat. It was part of the great symphony of weather that had been playing over Ireland since the island rose from the sea. As the thread built on the bobbin, Brigid's mind wandered through the memories that the songs awakened. This melody reminded her of her mother, dead these 10 years past, who had sat at this same wheel and sung these same songs. Her mother's voice had been sweet and true, and she had known more songs than anyone in the valley. She had been the keeper of the old stories, the one people came to when they needed to remember how something was done or why it was important. Music is memory, her mother had always said. The songs remember what we might forget. They hold the wisdom of the ancestors, the knowledge of how to live well in this world. And it was true. In the working songs were embedded the techniques of the crafts themselves. The rhythm told you how fast to spin. The melody guided your hands in their movements. The words reminded you of the right way to do each step. There was a song for every kind of work. Songs for spinning different fibers. Songs for dyeing wool. Songs for weaving at the loom. There were songs for planting and harvesting, for churning butter and brewing ale, for tending the sick and blessing the newborn. The songs were a library, written not on parchment, but in melody, carried not in books, but in the hearts of those who sang them. As she continued spinning, Brigid sang softly under her breath, the Gaelic words flowing like water over stones. The song she chose now was older than Christianity, a remnant of the time when the old gods walked among the people, and magic was as common as sunrise. It told of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine folk who had once ruled Ireland with wisdom and power, before they withdrew to the hollow hills and left the land to mortal men. The melody was haunting, full of minor intervals that spoke of loss and longing. But there was beauty in it too, and hope. The song promised that the old gods had not truly gone away, but only stepped back from the world of everyday sight. They were still there for those who knew how to look, still blessing those who remembered the old ways and honored the old wisdom. Brigid felt their presence sometimes, when she was deep in her work and the wheel was spinning true. She felt it now, as the candlelight danced and the rain sang on the roof. The cottage seemed to expand beyond its stone walls, to encompass all the cottages where women had ever worked at their spinning, all the evenings when thread had been drawn from wool and songs had been sung to make the time pass sweetly. The wool in her hands seemed to glow in the candlelight, each fiber catching and holding the golden radiance. The thread that formed was strong and even, perfect for the cloth she had in mind. This would become part of a cloak, a garment that would keep someone warm through the cold months ahead. Perhaps her youngest grandson, who was growing so fast that his mother could hardly keep him in clothes. Or perhaps her daughter Maeve, who had been complaining that her old cloak was wearing thin. The thought of family warmed Brigid's heart as much as the peat fire warmed her body. Her children were grown now, married and settled in their own homes, but the bonds between them remained strong. They came to visit regularly, bringing grandchildren to sit at her feet and learn the old stories. The wheel had always been a gathering place, its gentle rhythm drawing people close and encouraging conversation. How many evenings had she spent here with her own children gathered around, their young voices adding harmony to her songs. They had learned the melodies as naturally as they learned to walk, absorbing them through repetition and love. Now they sang the same songs in their own homes, passing the ancient wisdom to another generation. The rain was settling into a steady rhythm now, no longer the wild drumming of the storm's beginning, but the patient persistence that spoke of a long night's watering. This was the kind of rain that farmers welcomed, steady and soaking, the kind that would fill the wells and refresh the pastures. Tomorrow, the grass would be greener, the streams would run fuller, and the earth would give thanks for the sky's blessing. Brigid paused in her spinning to add another turf to the fire. The peat caught quickly, flaring bright for a moment, before settling into the characteristic slow burn that would last for hours. The scent of burning peat filled the cottage, earthy and sweet, a smell that spoke of home and safety to anyone raised in this land of bog and moor. As she resumed her work, she began a new song, one that told the story of wool's journey from sheep to cloth. It was a teaching song, designed to help young spinners remember all the steps in the long process. The melody was simple and repetitive, easy to remember and pleasant to sing, but the words contained generations of accumulated wisdom. From the sheep's back to the spinner's hand, the song began. The wool must travel through the land. It told of shearing in the spring, when the sheep were heavy with their winter coats and ready for relief. It spoke of washing in the clear stream, of drying in the summer sun, of carding and combing until the fibers lay smooth and ready. Then came the verses about dyeing, with their careful instructions disguised as poetry, which plants to gather and when, how to prepare the dye baths, how to mordant the wool so the colors would hold fast and true. The song was a complete education in the dyer's art, passed down in a form so beautiful that no one could forget it. The spinning verses came next, with their subtle guidance about tension and twist, about how to judge when the thread was ready, and how to wind it onto the bobbin without tangles. Then the weaving verses, which told of warping the loom and threading the heddles, of beating the weft and advancing the cloth, of the patterns that could be achieved with careful planning and skillful hands. Finally came the finishing verses, about fulling the cloth and raising the nap, about cutting and sewing and all the final steps that transformed raw wool into garments fit to wear. It was a complete curriculum, everything a young woman needed to know to become a skilled textile worker, all contained in a melody sweet enough to sing for pure pleasure. As Brigid sang, her hands moved in perfect rhythm with the music. The wheel turned steadily, the thread formed without pause or flaw, and the bobbin filled with perfect consistency. This was the meditation of the spinner, the trance-like state where body and mind worked in harmony, and time seemed to stretch like the wool itself, becoming longer and stronger than it appeared. She had been working now for over an hour, though it felt like minutes. The first bobbin was nearly full, the golden brown thread wound tight and even. Soon she would need to remove it and attach an empty one. But for now she was content to continue in the rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The candles had burned down noticeably, their flames settling lower in their holders. But they still gave good light, steady and warm, without the flicker that would strain tired eyes. Beeswax burned cleanly, without smoke or odor, creating perfect conditions for fine work. The expense was worth it for evenings like this, when the thread must be spun to the highest standard. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak. Rain lashed against the shutters and drummed on the roof with renewed intensity. Wind whistled around the cottage corners and set the thatch to rustling like a living thing. But the sounds only made the interior seem more cozy, more perfect in its warmth and shelter. The cottage was a haven in the storm, a place where civilization's flame burned bright against the wild darkness. Thunder rolled overhead now, closer than before. The storm was moving inland from the sea, bringing with it all the power and fury that the Atlantic could muster. Lightning flickered behind the shuttered windows, brief flashes that illuminated the cottage interior with stark white light. But even these dramatic interruptions could not disturb the peaceful rhythm of Brigid's work. She had weathered too many storms to be frightened by this one. The cottage had been built to withstand whatever weather Ireland could provide, and 40 years of occupation had proved its strength. The walls were solid, the roof was tight, and the foundation stones were set deep into the living rock of the hillside. Let the storm rage. She was safe within these walls, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. As she began another song, this one a lament for heroes long dead, Brigid thought of all the storms she had weathered in this place. Storms of weather and storms of the heart. Times when the world outside seemed wild and dangerous, but the cottage remained a constant refuge. Here she had raised her children, nursed them through sickness, celebrated their triumphs, comforted them in sorrow. Here too she had mourned her losses. Seamus, taken by fever in his prime, leaving her with 3 children and a farm to manage alone. Her youngest son, lost to the sea when his fishing boat was caught in a sudden squall. Her parents, gone to their rest after long lives well lived. Each loss had been weathered here, in the warmth and safety of stone walls and loving memory. But there had been joys as well, so many joys. Wedding celebrations that had filled the cottage with music and laughter. The births of grandchildren, each one a miracle of new life and hope. Harvest festivals when the whole community gathered to give thanks for the year's bounty. Quiet evenings like this one, when work and weather and song combined to create perfect contentment. The lament she was singing now told of Cuchulainn, the greatest hero of Ulster, and his tragic death defending his homeland against overwhelming odds. The melody was ancient and sorrowful, full of the wild beauty that characterized the oldest Irish music. As she sang, Brigid could almost see the hero in her mind, tall and fair and doomed, fighting his last battle with courage that transcended mortal fear. But even the saddest songs had their place in the great wheel of existence. They reminded the living that all mortal things must pass, that even the greatest heroes were subject to time and fate. But they also celebrated the courage and love that made brief lives shine like stars in the darkness. In singing of Cuchulainn's death, she was also celebrating his life, keeping alive the memory of what it meant to live and die with honor. The thread continued to flow through her fingers, steady and strong, like the song itself. Each length represented time transformed into something useful, moments that might have passed in idleness, instead made productive through skill and purpose. The thread would outlast the evening that created it, would become part of cloth that might serve for years. warming bodies and lifting spirits with its beauty. This was the satisfaction of the craftsperson, the knowledge that their work created lasting value. A song might fade on the air, but the thread would endure. An evening might pass into memory, but the cloth woven from this thread would continue to serve long after the spinner's hands were still. It was a kind of immortality, achieved not through fame or power, but through patient service to human need. As the first bobbin finally filled to capacity, Brigid allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The thread was perfect, even in weight and twist, consistent in color and texture. It would weave beautifully, creating cloth of the highest quality. She removed the full bobbin and set it aside, then attached an empty one to continue the evening's work. The break in rhythm gave her a chance to check the fire and trim the candle wicks. The peat was burning well, the flames dancing cheerfully among the turfs. The candles still had hours of life left in them, their golden light as steady as ever. Outside, the storm continued its wild music, but inside all was peace and order and purposeful activity. Starting the second bobbin required a moment of adjustment, attaching new leader thread and finding the rhythm again. But Brigid's hands knew the work so well that the pause was brief. Soon the wheel was turning steadily once more, and new thread was forming with the same perfection as the first. She chose a different song now, one that told of the season's endless cycle and the wisdom to be found in each. Spring with its new growth and fresh beginnings, summer with its abundance and long days, autumn with its harvest and preparation for winter, winter with its rest and renewal. Each season had its gifts, its lessons, its particular beauty. The song reminded her that she was living now in the season of autumn, both in the world outside and in her own life. The spring of youth was long past, with its urgency and passion. The summer of middle age was over too, with its busy productivity and constant motion. Now she was in life's autumn, a time for gathering the harvest of experience, for sharing the wisdom accumulated through decades of living. It was a good season, she reflected, as her hands guided the wool through its transformation. The wild emotions of youth had settled into peaceful acceptance. The frantic activity of middle years had given way to a more measured pace, where each action was considered and deliberate. There was time now for reflection, for appreciation of simple pleasures, for the deep satisfaction that came from work perfectly mastered. The autumn season brought its own beauties. The fierce green of summer had mellowed into gold and bronze and crimson. The harsh light had softened to honey-colored warmth. Even the storms were different, more about cleansing than destruction, preparing the world for winter's rest rather than battering it into submission. In her own life, too, autumn had its compensations. The children were grown and established, no longer requiring constant care and worry. The farm work that had once demanded every daylight hour was now managed by younger hands. There was time for the finer things, for crafts that required patience and skill, for songs that told of deeper truths than the simple working melodies of busier days. The thread built steadily on the second bobbin as these thoughts wandered through her mind. The rhythm of the work was so familiar that it required little conscious attention, freeing her mind to roam through memory and reflection. This was one of spinning's great gifts, the way it occupied the hands while leaving the spirit free to explore inner landscapes. She thought of her grandmother, who had lived to a great age and remained active almost to the end. The old woman had been a repository of knowledge, keeper of traditions that stretched back to the time before memory. She had known the healing properties of every plant that grew in the valley, the meaning of every weather sign, the proper rituals for every season and occasion. Most precious of all, she had known the songs, not just the working songs that every woman learned, but the ancient ballads that told of heroes and gods, of love and loss, and the great cycles that governed all existence. She had been the valley's living library, its keeper of cultural memory, its link to the wisdom of the ancestors. Brigid had tried to learn everything her grandmother could teach, sitting at the old woman's feet through long winter evenings, absorbing stories and songs and the subtle wisdom that came through lived experience. But she knew she had only captured a portion of what the old woman had known. So much knowledge died with each generation, lost because there were not enough hours in a lifetime to pass on all that had been learned. This was why the songs were so important. They carried knowledge in a form that could be remembered and transmitted, passed down through generations, without the need for writing or formal schooling. A melody once learned was rarely forgotten, and the words that went with it carried their cargo of wisdom safely through the years. As if responding to these thoughts, her voice found a new song, one her grandmother had taught her on an evening much like this one. It told of Brigid the goddess, the divine patron of smiths and poets, healers and craftspeople. The song was older than Christianity, though Christian elements had been woven into it over the centuries, creating a hybrid that honored both the old ways and the new. The goddess Brigid was said to inspire all creative work, to bless the hands that shaped metal or clay, that wove thread into cloth, or words into poetry. She was particularly the patron of women's crafts, watching over spinners and weavers, brewers and healers. To sing her song while working was to invoke her blessing, to connect with the divine source of all creativity. As Brigid sang, she felt the presence of her namesake goddess, a warmth that seemed to flow through her hands and into the thread itself. The wool responded to this blessing, flowing more smoothly, twisting more perfectly, becoming thread of exceptional quality. This was the magic that lived at the heart of all true craftsmanship, the connection between human skill and divine inspiration that transformed mere technique into art. The second bobbin was filling quickly now, the thread accumulating in neat layers that would make it easy to remove when the time came. Each layer was perfectly even, the result of decades of practice that had made the motions as automatic as walking. But automatic did not mean mindless. Rather, it meant that conscious skill had become unconscious wisdom, freeing the practitioner to focus on higher things. The rain outside had settled into a steady, soaking downpour that spoke of a long night's watering. This was the kind of rain that farmers prayed for, gentle enough not to wash away the soil, but persistent enough to penetrate deep into the earth. Tomorrow, the springs would run fuller, the wells would be topped up, and every growing thing would drink its fill of heaven's blessing. Brigid found the sound deeply soothing, a natural rhythm that complemented the spinning wheel's mechanical beat. Together, they created a complex polyrhythm that seemed to mirror the great cycles of existence. The wheel of seasons, the rhythm of day and night, the eternal dance of creation and destruction that kept the world in motion. The storm's intensity was beginning to moderate, the wild gusts settling into steadier winds that no longer rattled the shutters or set the thatch to dancing. But the rain continued unabated, drumming steadily on the roof and gurgling in the stone gutters that carried it away from the cottage walls. The sound was hypnotic, encouraging the kind of deep relaxation that came from knowing oneself to be safe and warm while wild forces raged outside. Lightning still flickered occasionally, but the thunder was growing more distant as the storm's heart moved inland toward the mountains. What remained was the gentler face of the tempest, the life-giving rain that would nourish the earth through the autumn months. This was weather to be welcomed rather than feared, a blessing disguised as wildness. As she began her third bobbin of the evening, Brigid chose a song that celebrated the partnership between human craft and natural gifts. It told of the sheep that gave their fleece, the plants that gave their colors, the earth that gave its clay for pots and its metal for tools. The song was a reminder that no craft existed in isolation, that all human making depended on the generosity of the natural world. The melody was gentle and grateful, full of appreciation for the abundance that surrounded those who knew how to see it. Even in winter's depths, when the land seemed barren and lifeless, the wise could find materials for their work. Roots could be gathered for dyes, clay could be dug for pottery, wood could be cut for tools and fuel. Nature's storehouse was never truly empty, only hidden from those who lacked the knowledge to find it. This knowledge was part of what made the difference between mere survival and true prosperity. A family that understood the full potential of their environment could thrive even in harsh times, finding resources where others saw only emptiness. The songs preserved this knowledge, encoding in memorable form the locations of useful plants, the timing of seasonal activities, the techniques for processing raw materials into finished goods. Brigid herself was a repository of such knowledge. She knew where the best madder grew, which springs produced water soft enough for dyeing, when the oak bark should be gathered for the strongest tanning. This knowledge had come to her through songs and stories, but also through decades of observation and experimentation, trial and error, guided by traditional wisdom. The thread continued to flow through her fingers as these thoughts occupied her mind. Each length was a small perfection, the result of skills refined over a lifetime of practice. The consistency was remarkable. Hour after hour, the thread maintained exactly the same weight and twist, the same strength and texture. This was mastery, achieved through countless repetitions that had trained hands and eyes to judge perfection by feel and sight alone. The cottage around her seemed to pulse gently with the rhythms of her work. The candlelight danced in time with the wheels turning. The shadows shifted with each movement of her hands. The very air seemed to vibrate with creative energy. This was what happened when skill reached the level of art, when craft became a form of prayer, when the boundary between worker and work dissolved into perfect unity. Time had taken on the strange quality it always did during deep work. Minutes stretched into hours, or hours compressed into moments, depending on the level of absorption achieved. Brigid had lost track of how long she had been spinning, aware only that darkness had settled fully outside and the candles had burned significantly lower. But there was no urgency, no sense that time was being wasted. This was time used to its highest purpose, transformed into something beautiful and useful. The third bobbin was nearing completion, its surface almost hidden beneath layers of perfect thread. This represented a significant amount of work, enough to weave several yards of cloth. Combined with thread from previous evenings, she would soon have enough to begin the winter cloak she had been planning, a garment that would provide both warmth and beauty to whoever wore it. The thought of the loom waiting in the corner filled her with anticipation. Weaving was different from spinning, requiring a different kind of attention, a different set of skills. Where spinning was meditative and solitary, weaving was more complex and engaging, requiring constant decision-making about pattern and color, tension and beat. The loom demanded a more active participation, a conscious collaboration between weaver and machine. But that was work for future evenings. Tonight was for spinning, for the gentle trance that came from repetitive motion and familiar songs. Tonight was for the quiet pleasure of watching wool transform into thread, of feeling the ancient patterns that connected her to every woman who had ever sat at a spinning wheel and felt the same satisfaction in work well done. As she began to fill the fourth bobbin of the evening, Brigid realized that the rain was beginning to soften. The drumming on the roof had settled into a gentler pattering, and the wind had nearly stilled. The storm was moving on, leaving behind the sweet smell of washed earth and the promise of clear skies tomorrow. But for now, the rain continued just enough to maintain the perfect atmosphere for indoor work. She chose a lullaby for her next song, one that she had sung to her own children and later to her grandchildren. The melody was simple and soothing, designed to calm restless spirits and encourage peaceful sleep. But tonight she sang it not to rock a baby to sleep, but to honor the peaceful contentment that filled her own heart. The lullaby told of a land where all was well, where the sun shone gently and the rains came softly, where children played safely and adults worked with joy. It was a vision of paradise, not as some distant heaven, but as a possibility that could be achieved through love and care and the patient tending of life's simple gifts. Tonight, in this cottage with its warm light and steady rhythms, that paradise seemed very near. The thread continued its steady accumulation, each revolution of the wheel adding to the store of wealth that would see the household through winter. But it was wealth measured not in gold or silver, but in the more fundamental currency of useful goods created by skillful hands. This thread would become cloth, cloth would become garments, garments would provide warmth and comfort to those she loved. This was the economy of the household, the system of production that had sustained human communities since the beginning of agriculture. Each family created what it needed through the application of knowledge and skill to natural materials. Surplus could be traded for goods that others produced better, but the foundation was self-sufficiency, the ability to transform raw materials into finished goods through one's own labor. The fourth bobbin was filling steadily as Brigid lost herself deeper in the meditative rhythm of the work. Her voice had grown softer with the advancing night, the lullaby melodies flowing like water over smooth stones. The cottage had taken on that special quality that came in the deep hours of productive solitude, when the boundary between self and surroundings seemed to dissolve into perfect harmony. Outside, the rain had gentled to a whisper, just enough moisture in the air to keep the world soft and receptive. The storm's wild passion had spent itself, leaving behind the kind of steady, soaking precipitation that would seep deep into the earth and emerge weeks later as fresh springs and fuller streams. This was the rain that replenished rather than destroyed, that gave life rather than taking it away. The candles had burned halfway down their length now, their flames steady and golden in the still air. The beeswax released its sweet fragrance as it melted, adding another layer to the cottage's complex perfume of peat smoke, wool lanolin, and the indefinable scent of a home well lived in. Each element contributed to the atmosphere of peace and purpose that made this evening feel like a blessing. As the fourth bobbin neared completion, Brigid began to sing one of the oldest songs she knew, a melody that predated even the ancient tales of heroes and gods. This was a song of the earth itself, of the cycles that governed all life, of the great wheel that turned through seasons and years and ages without end. The words were in the oldest form of Gaelic, so ancient that their meaning was more felt than understood, more intuited than translated. The song spoke of the time before time, when the land was young and the first people walked beneath skies unmarked by smoke or sorrow. It told of the great mother who gave birth to all living things, who breathed life into clay and set the stars in their courses. It was a creation song, a hymn of praise to the source from which all blessings flowed. As she sang, Brigid felt herself connected, not just to her own ancestors, but to all the women who had ever worked with fiber and flame, who had transformed raw materials into things of beauty and use. The thread flowing through her fingers seemed to carry their spirits with it, their knowledge and skill and love made manifest in wool, drawn fine and strong. The great loom in the corner caught the candlelight on its polished wood, throwing back warm reflections that made it seem almost alive. Soon this thread would find its destiny there, woven with other threads into patterns that would tell their own stories. But for now, it was enough to create the individual strands, each one perfect in itself, each one a note in the greater symphony that would become cloth. The rain outside had nearly stopped now, just the occasional drop falling from saturated thatch with a soft plop into the stone gutters. The silence that followed a storm was settling over the landscape, a peace so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. In this silence, the cottage's small sounds became magnified. The whisper of the spinning wheel, the soft crackle of peat in the fire, the gentle breathing of a woman at work. Brigid finished the fourth bobbin and set it aside with the others. 4 perfect cylinders of golden brown thread that represented the evening's labor. Together, they held enough thread to begin the winter cloak she had been planning, though she would need several more evenings' work to complete the quantity required. The prospect filled her with quiet pleasure. More evenings like this one, more opportunities to lose herself in the ancient rhythms of creation. She decided to begin one more bobbin before calling it a night. The candles still had life in them, the fire was burning well, and her hands showed no sign of fatigue. The rhythm of the work had energized rather than tired her, as good work always did when it was perfectly matched to the worker's skills and nature. For the final session of the evening, she chose wool of a different color, thread dyed the deep blue of summer twilight. This would add subtle variation to the finished cloth, creating depth and interest without disrupting the overall harmony of the piece. The blue thread would be used sparingly, woven into the fabric at intervals to catch the light and please the eye. The blue wool had its own character, slightly different from the brown in its feel and behavior. The plant dyes had altered the fiber in subtle ways, making it respond differently to the spinner's touch. But Brigid's experienced hands adjusted automatically, maintaining the same perfect tension and twist that had characterized the evening's work from the beginning. As she began the fifth bobbin, she sang a song that told of the sea, that great body of water that bounded Ireland on all sides and shaped its people's character. The melody rolled like waves against a shore, now gentle, now powerful, always moving in patterns older than human memory. The song spoke of fishing boats and seabirds, of storms weathered and safe harbors reached, of the eternal dialogue between land and water. Living so close to the Atlantic coast, Brigid had always been aware of the sea's presence. On quiet nights, she could hear its distant voice, the eternal conversation between wave and stone that had been going on since the world began. The sea brought rain clouds and storm winds, but also the moisture that kept the land green and fertile. It was both friend and adversary, provider and destroyer, deserving of respect and careful attention. Her youngest son had been claimed by the sea, lost in a sudden squall that turned a routine fishing trip into tragedy. For years after that, she had found it difficult to sing the sea songs, their beauty poisoned by grief. But time had healed even that deep wound, and now she could find comfort in the melodies that celebrated the sea's beauty while acknowledging its danger. The thread flowing through her fingers seemed to catch some of the sea's character, strong and flexible, with a subtle shimmer that came from the indigo dye. This thread would add life to whatever cloth it graced, a reminder of water's constant movement and the beauty that could be found in even the most dangerous elements of the natural world. The cottage had settled into the deepest peace of the night now. All the small settling sounds of wood and stone completed hours ago. The only movements were those of the spinning wheel and the woman who guided it, and the occasional flicker of candle flame or peat ember. This was the hour when the boundary between waking and dreaming grew thin, when work became meditation and meditation became prayer. Brigid's voice grew softer still as she sang, the melodies becoming more felt than heard. The songs were part of her now, as natural as breathing or heartbeat. They flowed through her and out into the night, carrying with them all the love and wisdom accumulated through decades of living. In singing, she was both preserving the past and creating the present, both honoring tradition and adding her own voice to the eternal chorus. The fifth bobbin filled more slowly than the others, as if the night itself was reluctant to end this perfect session of work and song. But all things must conclude, and as the thread reached the bobbin's capacity, Brigid allowed herself a moment of deep satisfaction. 5 bobbins of perfect thread, enough work for a productive evening by any measure, created in conditions of ideal peace and beauty. She removed the final bobbin and set it with the others, then sat back to contemplate her achievement. The thread caught the candlelight and seemed to glow from within, as if it had absorbed some of the evening's golden atmosphere. Tomorrow, she would wind it into skeins and add it to her store. But for now, it was enough to simply appreciate the perfection of its creation. The candles were burning low now, their flames settling deep into the wax pools that surrounded them. But they would burn for hours yet, long enough to light her preparations for sleep and the final rituals that would close the evening properly. The fire too was settled for the long night ahead, the peat glowing steadily in its bed of ash. Brigid rose from her spinning stool with a slight stiffness that spoke of hours spent in focused work. But it was a good stiffness, the kind that came from muscles well used rather than strained. She moved about the cottage, checking that all was secure for the night, banking the fire and trimming the candle wicks to ensure they would burn cleanly until morning. The spinning wheel she cleaned carefully, removing every trace of oil or lint that might affect tomorrow's work. The wheel was more than a tool. It was a partner in creation, deserving of the same care and respect that one would give to any valued friend. She covered it with a linen cloth to protect it from dust and drafts, whispering a brief blessing of gratitude for the evening's perfect performance. The wool remaining, she returned to its cedar chest, where lavender and rosemary would keep it sweet and free from moths. Each skein was wrapped carefully, protected from light and moisture that might fade the colors or weaken the fibers. This wool was too precious to risk through careless storage. It represented not just the raw materials of her craft, but the accumulated knowledge and skill of generations of dyers and spinners. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving behind the sweet, clean smell of washed earth and growing things. When Brigid opened her door briefly to check the weather, she was greeted by air so pure and soft, it seemed to caress her skin. Stars were beginning to appear between the departing clouds, their light reflected in puddles that caught and held fragments of sky. The night was profound and peaceful. The kind of stillness that came after storms had cleansed the air and settled the earth. Somewhere an owl called, its voice haunting and beautiful in the darkness. The sound spoke of wild things following their ancient patterns, of life continuing in its eternal cycles regardless of human concerns. Brigid closed the door and secured it with its wooden bar, completing the cottage's transformation into a secure haven for the night. The outside world could continue its wild business. Within these walls was warmth and light, and the satisfaction of work perfectly completed. The evening songs still echoed in her memory, their melodies weaving themselves into dreams that would carry her gently into sleep. She prepared for rest with the same careful attention she had given to her work. The spinning clothes were folded and put away, replaced by a soft linen nightgown that her daughter had sewn with loving hands. Her hair still thick despite her years, she braided loosely for sleep, securing it with a ribbon of her own weaving. Before extinguishing the candles, she spent a few moments in quiet gratitude for the evening's blessings. The work had gone perfectly, the thread was beautiful, and the songs had flowed like water from a spring. The storm had provided the perfect soundtrack, wild enough to make the cottage's warmth precious, gentle enough not to threaten or disturb. She thought of all the evenings to come, when the wheel would turn again and new thread would form beneath her hands. Each would be different in its details, but all would share the essential character of this night, the peace that came from skilled work, the joy that flowed from connection to ancient traditions, the deep satisfaction of creating beauty from simple materials. The candles guttered and went out one by one, their work completed as surely as her own. The cottage settled into the deeper darkness that preceded dawn, but it was not empty darkness. It was full of the presence of work well done, of songs sung truly, of another day lived in harmony with the great patterns that governed all existence. In her bed, soft with feather mattress and woolen blankets of her own making, Brigid settled into the drowsy peace that follows perfect work. The rain had blessed the earth, her hands had blessed the wool, and the night would bless her rest. The wheel would turn again tomorrow, as it had turned for countless generations before her, and would turn for countless generations after. But tonight was complete in itself, a perfect jewel of time when all the elements had combined to create something beautiful. The thread would endure, the songs would continue, and the ancient craft would pass to other hands in due season. For now, it was enough to have participated once more in the great work of creation, adding her own small contribution to the vast tapestry of human making. Sleep came gently, carried on the last echoes of the evening's songs. In dreams, Brigid walked through fields of sheep, whose fleeces shone like spun gold, while ancient voices sang the old songs that had guided her hands and blessed her work. The wheel turned in her dreams as it had in life, creating thread that stretched into the future and back into the past, connecting all times and all spinners in the endless web of creation. The cottage rested too, its stones holding the warmth of the day's fire, its thatch sheltering all within from whatever weather the night might bring. And in the morning, when light returned to the world, the wheel would be ready to turn again, and new songs would rise to bless the ancient work of transforming wool into wonder, fiber into beauty, simple materials into the complex miracle of human craft and care. Outside, the last drops fell from saturated eaves, each one catching starlight like a tiny prism before surrendering to Earth's patient gravity. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and ready for whatever blessings the new day might bring. And in the stone cottage where candlelight had danced and songs had flowed, peace settled like a blessing on the work-worn hands and the dreaming heart of one who had spent her evening well, adding her voice to the eternal chorus of those who create beauty from the simple stuff of earth and time and patient love.